Las Vegas, December 1968. The Sands Hotel, 11:47 p.m. In a room filled with Hollywood's most powerful men, Frank Sinatra in the front row, Sammy Davis Jr. 3 seats over, producers, mobsters, and movie stars. A comedian named Don Rickles is about to cross a line that doesn't exist on any map. The line that separates performance from reality, cruelty from comedy, a career from oblivion. Because in 7 minutes, Don Rickles will say something that makes Dean Martin stop smiling. And in that silence, everyone in the Sands Hotel believes they're about to witness the end of Don Rickles' career. But what actually happened that night is a story about the rarest thing in Hollywood. To understand what happened that December night, you need to understand what Las Vegas was in 1968. This wasn't the corporate Las Vegas of today. This was mob Las Vegas, where Meyer Lansky's money built the casinos, where favors were currency, and where reputation could be destroyed with a single phone call. At the center of this world was the Rat Pack, 5 men who weren't just entertainers, they were American royalty. They gambled with presidents, they drank with gangsters, they made and broke careers on a whim. And then there was Don Rickles, born Donald J. Rickles in Queens, New York, May 8, 1926. Son of an insurance salesman, a Navy veteran who served on the U.S. Siren during World War II, a man who tried and failed to make it as a serious dramatic actor. By 1957, at age 31, Rickles was working a small club in Miami Beach called the Slate Brothers. One night, Frank Sinatra walked in. The room froze. Every comedian in America knew. When Sinatra enters, you stop your set. You acknowledge him. You thank him for coming. You do not, under any circumstances, insult him. Don Rickles looked at Frank Sinatra and said, "Make yourself at home, Frank. Hit somebody." Sinatra didn't just laugh. He adopted Rickles, brought him into the Rat Pack orbit, made him the unofficial court jester of the most powerful entertainment clique in the world. Rickles built his entire career on a simple but dangerous premise. He would insult anyone, movie stars, politicians, mobsters. The worse the insult, the bigger the laugh. But there was a code, an invisible set of rules. You could mock someone's appearance, their career, their public persona, but you never ever touched what was real. And that's where Dean Martin comes in. Dean Martin wasn't born Dean Martin. He was born Dino Paul Crosetti on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, a steel town on the Ohio River where the air smelled like sulfur and the streets were paved with immigrant dreams. His father, Gaetano, was a barber. His mother, Angela, spoke only Italian. Dino didn't speak English until he was 5 years old. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. He worked as a bootlegger's driver, a steelworker, a gas station attendant, and a croupier in illegal backroom casinos. He even boxed under the name Kid Crochet, a name he chose because he couldn't spell Crosetti. He fought in dozens of matches, broke his nose twice, and learned something critical: how to take a punch without showing pain. This ability, to be hurt and show nothing, would define his entire life. In 1946, Dean Martin met Jerry Lewis. Together, they became the biggest comedy act in America. They sold out theaters. They signed a $50 million film deal, unprecedented at the time. They were inseparable until July 25, 1956, when after 10 years of partnership, Dean Martin walked away. Jerry Lewis was devastated. He cried in public. He told reporters he felt abandoned. Dean Martin said nothing, because Dean Martin had learned early in public: you smile, you sing, you hold your drink, and make it look effortless. But what you feel, that's nobody's business. His solo career exploded. He became bigger than he ever was with Lewis. He starred in the original Ocean's 11. He hosted The Dean Martin Show, one of the highest-rated programs on television. He cultivated an image, the lovable drunk, the guy who stumbled through songs with a cocktail glass, half asleep, half charming. But here's Stitz, what most people didn't yet know. That wasn't set alcohol. It was apple juice. Dean Martin's entire public persona was a performance, a mask so convincing that even his closest friends sometimes forgot it was a mask. But underneath, Dean Martin was a deeply private man, a father of 7 children from 2 marriages, a man who suffered profound loss when his son, Dean Paul Martin, died in a military plane crash in 1987. At the funeral, Dean Martin didn't cry. He stood silent, stone-faced, because that's what he did. He took the punch. He showed nothing. So when Don Rickles stepped on stage that December night in 1968, he wasn't facing a drunk. He wasn't facing a character. He was facing a man who had spent his entire life building walls no one could see, and Rickles was about to try to climb them. December 17th, 1968. The Copa Room at the Sands Hotel. Capacity, 650 people. On tonight's head count, 680. Standing room only. Because when Don Rickles performs, and the Rat Pack shows up, you don't leave. You don't even blink. Front row, center. Frank Sinatra. 3 seats to his right, Sammy Davis Jr. In the 4th row, Dean Martin, nursing what looks like a whiskey, but is probably ginger ale. 11:42 p.m. Don Rickles walks on stage. He's 42 years old, at the height of his powers. He scans the room like a predator selecting prey. He starts with Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, ladies and gentlemen, the man who put the theed organized dift in organized crime. Sinatra loves it. He raises his glass. The room exhales. Rickles moves on, points at Sammy Davis Jr. And Sammy Davis Jr., the only man in history to be black, Jewish, and missing an eye, and still have more women than me. The room is his. Every insult lands. Every target laughs. This is what Rickles does. He finds your insecurity and makes you laugh at it before anyone else can. And then Rickles' sixth eyes land on Dean Martin. Now, here's where the accounts start to differ. We don't have footage of what was said next. The Sands didn't record every show. What we have are memories, witnesses, and the problem with memories is they change, depending on who's telling the story. According to multiple witnesses, Rickles started the way he always did. Dean Martin, everybody, looking drunk, as usual. Dean, you fur's so drunk, you think the floor show is a documentary. Dean Martin smiled, raised his glass. The room relaxed, but Rickles didn't stop. Seriously, Dean, if you stopped drinking, you Ted have no personality left. We Ted have to check your pulse to see if you Ted still Dean Martin, or just a corpse in a tuxedo. And then, according to Joey Bishop, and at least 3 other witnesses, Rickles said this. Dean Sepp's whole life is an act. The singing, the charm, the thing. I don't thet. Care Tate. You know what Dean Martin cares about? His drink. That theps. It's his kids probably think the bartender raised them. The laughter stops. Dead silence. Joey Bishop would later say, I've seen Don insult everybody. Presidents. Mob bosses. But when he said that about Dean Sepp's kids, I knew. We all knew. He went too far. Because in the Rat Pack, there was one rule. Everyone understood, but nobody said out loud. You can mock Dean's drinking. You can mock his laziness. You can mock his women, but you don't touch his family. Dean Martin had 7 children. His oldest son, Craig, from his first marriage, struggled with addiction. His daughter, Claudia, had just gone through a painful divorce. Dean Paul, his youngest son, was only 16 and would die in that plane crash 19 years later. These children were the only thing in Dean Martin's life that wasn't an act, and Don Rickles had just used them as punchlines. Dean Martin sets down his glass, slowly, deliberately. Then Dean Martin stands up. When Dean Martin stood up, 680 people held their breath, because everyone in that room knew what Dean Martin was capable of. This was a man who fought for money as a teenager, who worked for bootleggers, who once told a reporter, "I don't get mad, I get even." Dean Martin, walking slowly toward the stage, each step deliberate. Don Rickles stopped talking. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in Sinatra's drink. He walked onto the stage, stood next to Rickles, close enough to touch him. Rickles tried to laugh, tried to turn it into a bit. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Martin, my next victim. Or am I his?" Dean didn't have laugh. He just looked at Rickles. And then in a voice so quiet the microphone barely picked it up, he said, "Don't that joke. Don't that do it again." Not a threat, not yelling, just a statement, simple, final. And then Dean Martin turned around and walked off the stage. He didn't storm out. He didn't make a scene. He went back to his table. As if nothing had happened, the show continued. Rickles finished his set. Ceaseless, people laughed, but differently, carefully. But backstage, Don Rickles was terrified. Because in 1968, Las Vegas, if Dean Martin decided you were done, you were done. One phone call, one word to the casino bosses, and you'd never work the strip again. 10 minutes passed. 20. Then someone knocked on the door. Dean Martin. He handed one glass to Rickles. And then Dean Martin said something that Don Rickles would repeat for the rest of his life. Dean Martin looked at Don Rickles and said, "Don, I get it. I understand the guy on stage. That hip's your job. You supposed to tear people apart. That hip's why we love you. But off stage, you gotta know the line. You can hit me about drinking, about being lazy, about anything you see me do in public. But when you talk about my kids, that fits. Not the guy on stage you for hitting. That fits. Me, the real me. And you can touch that." Rickles later told this story in a 1995 interview with Larry King. And he said this, Dean Martin taught me something that night that I never forgot. There's stays the person people see, and there's stays the person underneath. You can destroy the image, but never the person. Dean Martin didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He simply drew a line, quietly, calmly, and Don Rickles never crossed it again. For the next 27 years, Don Rickles continued to roast Dean Martin, but he never mentioned his children again. Never went near his marriages, never touched what was real. And the two men became genuine friends. Not Rat Pack friends, not Hollywood friends, real friends. Because Dean Martin didn't destroy Don Rickles that night. He protected him. He protected him from himself. What happened in that dressing room wasn't just conflict resolution. It was a masterclass in something psychologists call assertive boundary setting. Dr. Henry Cloud, clinical psychologist and author of Boundaries, When to Say Yes, How to Say No, breaks down what Dean Martin did. First, he didn't attack. He didn't say, "You stir a terrible person," or "You always do this." He focused on the specific behavior, that joke. "Don't do it again." Second, he didn't explain or justify. He didn't give Rickles ammunition for debate. He simply stated the boundary. Third, he didn't punish. He came back with a drink, with friendship. He separated the behavior from the person. Most people, when hurt, do one of two things. They explode in anger, or they swallow it and say nothing. Dean Martin did neither. He created what psychologists call a clean boundary, a limit that protects without destroying. And that's why the relationship survived, because Rickles didn't feel destroyed. He felt corrected. And there's a difference. Neuroscientist Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett explains it this way. When someone attacks us, our amygdala, the brain's threat detector, lights up. We enter fight or flight. But when someone calmly states a boundary, the prefrontal cortex stays engaged. We can still think, still process, still learn. Dean Martin's tone, quiet, controlled without malice, allowed Don Rickles' brain to hear the message instead of preparing for war. That's why, when Dean Martin stood up, he didn't raise his voice, didn't clench his fists, didn't make it a spectacle. He treated Rickles like a friend who made a mistake, not an enemy who needed to be destroyed. And in doing so, he saved both of them. Here sits what didn't sit happen after that night. No headlines, no gossip columns, no public feud. The next night, Dean Martin performed at the Sands. Don Rickles was in the audience. They waved to each other. The audience cheered, because that was the Rat Pack way. What happened in the room stayed in the room. No lawsuits, no managers, no press releases, just men talking to men. Over the next 3 decades, Dean Martin and Don Rickles appeared together dozens of times. Roasts, variety shows, private parties. In 1973, Dean Martin hosted his famous celebrity roast TV specials. Don Rickles was on every single one, and he tore Dean apart, but differently, with love underneath the insults. In 1995, Dean Martin made his last public appearance at a tribute for Frank Sinatra. He was 78. His son Dean Paul had been dead for 8 years. He looked broken. Backstage, Don Rickles found him, and instead of a joke, he just hugged him. Witnesses reported. Rickles whispered, "Set, I love you, Dean. I always have." Dean Martin died 2 years later, December 25th, 1995, Christmas Day. At the funeral, Don Rickles didn't perform, didn't make jokes. He sat silently in the back row and cried. When Rickles himself died in 2017, at age 90, his family released a statement, and in it, they mentioned Dean Martin. Ted Don always said Dean Martin taught him the difference between hurting someone, image, and hurting their soul. He never forgot that lesson, because that December night in 1968 wasn't about a fight. It was about 2 men learning to see each other. The comedian who built a career on cruelty, and the crooner who built a career on charm. Both of them hiding who they really were, until one night, in a dressing room at the Sands, when Dean Martin said, "You can destroy the mask, but don't touch the man." So here sits the answer to the question we started with. What happened when Don Rickles crossed the line? Dean Martin didn't destroy him. He didn't shame him. He didn't make him pay. He just showed him where the line was. And in doing that, in that single act of quiet, controlled honesty, Dean Martin gave Don Rickles something more valuable than applause. He gave him permission to be human, because that's what real friendship is. Not the people who laugh at all your jokes, but the people who tell you kindly, clearly, without malice, when you've gone too far. Don Rickles spent 60 years making people laugh by tearing them apart. But the greatest gift he ever received was from the one man who refused to be torn. The silence that saved a career was really the friendship that saved a life. If this story taught you something about boundaries, about friendship, or about the difference between performance and truth, there's another story you need to hear. Because the Rat Pack wasn't just about music and movies. It was about power, loyalty, and the price both demanded. Until then, remember, the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, the strongest person is the one who knows when to whisper.